Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos. This block is called Flower Garden, and it finishes 12 inches. Here's the diagram, and we just have half square triangles in these outer corners. We have the 4 patch is the corner unit. The quarter square triangle unit are the side units, and then a square, simple square, for the center. Here are 4 blocks, set block to block, but this has sashing. It looked a little bit better to me with a little bit of sashing, and you have a little pinwheel in the center when these meet. This is a 3x3 grid, and since it's a 12-inch block, the units in each grid space will finish at 4 inches. So here is the half square triangle is a 2-inch finished because there are 2 spaces here, and this 4 patch is 4-inch finished, as well as the quarter square triangle is 4-inch finished, and the square in the center is 4-inch finished. So that's why we use the grid method. It helps us to determine what size to make the units. I wanted to give you a little lesson about what is a patch. People always ask me, what are patches? It's so confusing when you say patches and squares. If you were making a quilt just starting out and all you have is a cutting mat, a rotary cutter, and a regular ruler, you would be cutting patches. And I'll show you an example with half square triangles. So in your cutting instructions, you'll often see cut a square 3 inches by 3 inches and cut it in half once on the diagonal. Then you get 2 patches. And here's what they mean. I've got these squares cut at 3 inches. I want to make a 2-inch finished half square triangle. So I cut it just slightly larger than what I need. I'm going to take this piece, I've cut my square, and I'm going to cut it in half once on the diagonal for 2 patches. So now I have 2 patches. I'm going to do the same thing with this red fabric. This is the other half of my half square triangle. Now I have 2 patches. So I take these, and if I switch these and piece those together, I have 2 half square triangles. So if I wanted 4 half square triangles, I would do another set. And this set would make 2 half square triangles. So you flip these over and you stitch scant 1/4 inch, and then you'll have your half square triangle. The other method, which a lot of people do, is to make them 2 at a time or 8 at a time. So here's how you make 2 at a time. We take the same 3-inch squares that we cut, and on the back of the light fabric, I've drawn a diagonal line. So you see how it's the same. We cut the diagonal line before, now we're drawing on the diagonal line first. We'll put the 2 fabrics together. When I take this to my machine, I'm going to sew a scant 1/4 inch on both sides of this line. For me, I have a little metal guide on my presser foot that is a 1/4 inch. So if I want a 1/4 inch, I'd put that presser foot right on this line, and it would give me a 1/4 inch. But I want a scant 1/4 inch. I want to give me a little bit more wiggle room when I'm making these triangles. So if I'm stitching this way, I'll put my little metal guide right to the right-hand side of this line, not on the line. Then I'll make this stitch, flip it around, and do the same thing on this side. So I've made 2 rows of stitching. Here I have my 2 rows of stitching, and then I cut it in half on the diagonal line. Open it up, and I have a half square triangle. And at this point, it's slightly larger than what I need. The patches that I cut earlier, I've sewed them together, and here's what they look like pressed. They're virtually exactly the same. We did the same thing, only in 2 different steps. We cut these larger, and we want to trim them down. There's all kind of rulers you can use for trimming down. I have a 6.5 inch ruler I usually use. We want to trim these down to 2-inch finished, which means we trim it to 2.5 inches. I place the diagonal line along the seam line. We want to make sure that we have enough over the 2.5 inch on this side and this side, and then we're going to trim this side first. Trim, and this cuts off your little nubs. Now the two edges we cut, we flip these over, and now we'll have our two edges we need to cut. Now you line up 2.5 inches there and down here, and then the diagonal line, and you trim. And now you have a perfectly sized 2.5 inch measured half square triangle. People who are just beginning, and even some people like me have been doing this for years, get better results when you make them slightly larger and trim them down. You can do that with flying geese when you do 4 at a time. You can do it with quarter square triangles 4 at a time. And anything having to do with a triangle, you pretty much can make the triangles bigger and trim them down to the size you need. Now that you know what patches are, we can look at the patches for this block. And I also wanted to add, we have the AccuQuilt dies that will cut these shapes. And when you're using AccuQuilt, you are cutting patches and you're sewing patches together. So when you cut half square triangles, normally you get two patches just like this. So you'll have to cut a light side and a dark side. I would demonstrate using the AccuQuilt, but we're getting ready to move, so I packed all that and I can't demonstrate that right now, but in the future I will do that as soon as we get settled in our new place. So let's go over the patches now. Patch A is a 2-inch finished half square triangle. So you know by now we'll cut 2 7/8 inch squares, cut them in half once on the diagonal for 2 patches. We need 4 patches of each of these fabrics, just like you saw. So that means we will have to cut 2 squares. And here are the AccuQuilt dies. Patch B is a 2-inch finished square. Now patch B is a patch. So this is the size you cut. That's the smallest size that this patch will be. You cut 2.5 inch squares. You'll need 4 of this green fabric and 8 of the background fabric. And I forgot to tell you that when I make these diagrams, they come from AccuQuilt. And AccuQuilt uses patches. They call them patches. It's just easier to do it that way. It goes back to the beginning of patchwork quilting. That's why it's called patchwork quilting. You're working with patches. Okay, so let's go back. Patch C is a 4-inch finished quarter square triangle. And you'll take your 5 1/4 inch square, cut them in half on the diagonal twice, and you'll get 4 patches. With the half square triangle, we got 2 patches because we cut it once. Now we cut this one twice and we get 4 patches. So you'll need 8 patches of this fabric and 8 patches of the background. And what that means is you'll need to cut 2 5 1/4 inch squares. And if you want to make these bigger and trim them down, you can do that. And I'll have that in the cutting instructions. Patch D is a 4-inch finished square. We cut 4 1/2 inch squares, and we just need 1 for the center. For rotary cutting, we're going to use scant 1/4 inch. That helps us with a little bit more wiggle room when we're trying to get these triangles to work out right. In this video, we're going to use the 2 at a time half square triangle method and the 4 at a time quarter square triangle method. For AccuQuilt cutting, it's a true 1/4 inch. That's how they design the dies for a true 1/4 inch seam. And for the half square triangles and the quarter square triangles, and using AccuQuilt, we cut patches and we sew patches. As always, I recommend to make a test block before cutting multiple blocks. Now let's look at the cutting. For this red fabric, this is the half square triangle in the corners. There's a red and a background fabric. We'll cut 2 7/8 inch squares. That's if you want the exact size, or cut 3 squares if you want to trim later. For half square triangles, 2 at a time. Or you can take your 2 squares, whichever size you cut them, and cut them in half once diagonally for your 4 patches you'll need. Patch B is this green fabric, and we're cutting squares. We have the small squares here and the large square in the center. So we'll cut 4 2.5-inch squares, and we'll cut 1 4.5-inch square. Now here's the background fabric, and this is in the half square triangles, it's in the quarter square triangles, and it's the small squares on the corner units. So for A, which is the half square triangle, we'll cut 2 7/8 inches squares, or cut 3-inch squares if you want to make them larger. For half square triangles, 2 at a time. And you can always cut them in half diagonally for your 4 patches if you want to sew patches. Patch B, we cut 8 2.5-inch squares. Patch C, this is for the quarter square triangle unit. If you want to cut the actual size, you cut 2 at 5¼ inches. You can cut it 5½ inches if you want to trim it down later. These are the squares for the quarter square triangles, 4 at a time. You can always cut them in half twice for 8 patches and sew your patches. And the same exact thing we cut here for patch C, we're going to cut this fabric for patch C, because we'll use these two together to make the quarter square triangles 4 at a time. Now here are the fabrics that are cut. These are the squares we're going to use for the quarter square triangles 4 at a time. And I've cut these the actual size, so I won't be trimming these down. These are for the half square triangles, and you just saw a demo of that. And we'll use the 2 at a time method to make these half square triangles. And these are just square patches. We'll keep them like this till we need to sew them into the units. And this is the square for the center. So we'll start off by piecing the half square triangles 2 at a time. And you just saw the demo, so use that demo and make your 4 half square triangles. In step 2, we're going to piece the 4 patch unit that goes in the corner. We have our half square triangles done, and we're going to take the squares, and you just look at the diagram and lay the pieces out. And here's your little 4 patch unit. You're going to make 4 of these and press the seams open. And for step 3, we'll make the quarter square triangle units 4 at a time. We have our 4 squares. They're either cut 5¼ inches or 5½ inches and trimmed down later. We take the light fabric and draw a diagonal line and put the 2 pieces together. And what you're doing now is you're just like you did with your half square triangles, you're going to make 4 half square triangles. Stitch on both sides of the diagonal line your scant 1/4 inch. Now we cut both of them in half on the diagonal line. Normally I say press the seams open, but for this method we're going to press toward the dark fabric. Next we'll take 2 of the half square triangles, place them right sides together like this. We have alternating the light and dark, so place the light fabric over the dark fabric. And you're going to nest these seams together. This is why I use pressed toward the dark side. And you can feel with your fingers when those are nested. And what I like to do is put pins in it so nothing will move. And we're going to take a ruler, draw a diagonal line that's perpendicular to your seam. You know the drill by now. We're going to stitch a scant 1/4 inch on both sides of this line, and do that to this other set as well. Before we stitch it, I'm going to show you what it looks like. Once you stitch on this line, if I lay my ruler here and lift this up, you'll see that this is what the quarter square triangle will look like. So you want these lines to match up. Now they're stitched, and here's what it will look like. So cut on both diagonal lines. You have your 4 quarter square triangles. You can press these seams open or to one side, whichever you like. If you've cut your squares larger and you need to trim down now, we're going to trim them up. So we want a 4½ inch trimmed unit. So half of 4½ is 2¼ and I look on my ruler and I have a 2¼ mark here, and it comes all the way down to this diagonal line. Here's 2 1/4, and here's where it intersects this diagonal line. And there's 2 1/4 this way. This is the point you want to put right in the center of the block. So let me line it up and I'll show you. I'm lining up the diagonal line on the ruler with the seam line, and then this 2 1/4 inch mark, I'm lining up right in the center, the intersection in the center. Now I didn't cut these larger, so I'm looking on this side and it's 4.5 inches here, 4.5 inches here. And I have a little bit to cut off here and a little bit up here. So I'm going to do that. And you want these trimmed down to 4.5 inches. And these parts were okay. I'm just going to trim off the nubs. But if you cut your squares larger, you'll be trimming all 4 sides. Remember to find the halfway mark and put that in the center and line up your seam line. All of our units are finished, and we're just going to lay our units out in our 3x3 grid. We'll start here in the center, follow our diagram, and lay out the pieces. And there we have our block. Sew the top units together in a row, the middle and the bottom. Press your seams, then sew the rows together. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos.